I'm Christian Dorr, and join with me today is college professor and author William Burns.
Hello, everyone.
And we're doing a retrospective on George Romero's Dead series, which started with the 1968 classic Night of the Living Dead. And I decided to do this retrospective because this year, 2018, is the 50th anniversary of that film. So, what do you think of the original Night of the Living Dead?
Well, and I think it's one of the most revolutionary films ever made. You know, I think a lot of times people, again, we'll just sort of put it in the sort of horror category, but it's just an amazing film, and I think it was so influential, even outside of horror. I think that the film very much reflects the time it was made in the context. And 1968 was one of the most volatile years in the United States, as well as across the world. I mean, in Vietnam, you had, the students and the workers almost taking over the government in France. So you had this huge upheaval. You had the assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert Kennedy. So it was a very, very sort of volatile year. And then you have this film, which is just as revolutionary, coming out. You know, you had this idea of sort of one way of life trying to overtake another way of life, masses trying to sort of, exert their own existence. You have people fighting against that. So again, it's a very revolutionary film because they were very revolutionary times.
Yeah. The movie does have a lot of social commentary, but I almost feel like a lot of the social commentary was almost accidental. Like, okay, you have Ben, the main character, a black man, and that was revolutionary for the time to have a black man as your lead protagonist. But from what I've heard, that wasn't really a conscious decision. Like, Romero just happened to know Dwayne Jones, and it's like, he casted him, and he thought he was the best for the part. So it's at least the social commentary in that regard. Some people have read like a racial allegory for it, and a lot of that really was kind of accidental.
Well, I agree with that. I mean, to me, that's one of the things I think that Romero purposely, I think, shied away from. Because in the film, what I think really comes out in the film is that in the face of these, like an apocalyptic moment, black, white, race, nationality, ethnicity, those things don't matter. In this film, it's about humans versus zombies. That's it. So in this moment, when you have this zombie, or ghouls as they're called, because they're actually not called zombies in the film, they're called ghouls in the film. Yeah. All of a sudden, when you're faced with this kind of these hordes of predatory sort of beings coming at you, things like nationality, race don't matter anymore. It's a matter of prey, predator. It's a matter of consumer, food. It's a matter of living and dead, or walking dead, or whatever you want to call it. But I really think that that's one of the points that Romero was trying to make in this film, is that in the face of catastrophe, in the face of upheaval, we have to forget about our individual, backgrounds, or our individual sort of classifications, whether they be racial, gender, nationality, ethnicity, creed, what we believe in. Those things go out the window, and it becomes a matter of who is going to survive, who's going to live, who's going to fight, who's going to lie down and be consumed. So I agree with you. I think that the overall revolutionary aspect of the film is really about that. It's not so much about individual ideologies. It's not that this film is a movie that takes up the left side or the right side of the political spectrum, or it's pro or anti any group, any race. It's about living and dead. It's about being able to survive in the face of something catastrophic, something that is going to heave society and turn it over to a new way of existing.
What makes me sort of see a racial allegory in this film, whether Romero intended it or not, is at the end, after Ben is accidentally shot, they carry his body out to the pit with meat hooks, and I always kind of saw that as a bit of a metaphor for how black people throughout history were kind of always viewed as something less than human, but maybe I'm reaching way deeper than was actually intended.
No, I can see where you're going with that. I think it would probably that interpretation would probably have more credibility and validity if, let's say, that the fire pit that Ben's being dragged into was like filled with like black people or something like that. But the fact that it's like he's just seen. I don't think he's shot because he's black. I think he's shot because he looks like a zombie, because he's so shell shocked. Yeah. In what happened. So then that again goes back to the idea of, in the face of these kind of catastrophes, it's about being living or being dead. That's it. And in the film, it seems like at least it's interpreted as Ben is sort of just so shell shocked that he's almost dead himself. So that's the reason why he's shot.
Yeah.
So again, I don't think he was shot because he was black. I think he was shot because of the expectation that the only people in the farmhouse were going to be zombies, that everybody else has been dead. But I can totally see where you're going with it. But again, I think that Romero purposely shies away from those things to suggest that something in these times in 1968, the very thing that was dividing people were classifications like race, like black versus white, left versus right, anti-war versus pro-war. Like those are the things that were dividing us and let us become prey.
Yeah.
By not coming together, So again, that's just my own take on it.
All right. But I do think the humans are kind of the problem in the movie, because if you think about it, if the main characters were just able to get along and work together, they probably would have survived the night. But because they couldn't put their own bullshit aside, that's what kind of got them in the end.
Yeah, ego, right? Ego and lack of communication. And again, I don't think it was because somebody was an African American or somebody was this or somebody was that. I think it was just this idea again of human beings' egos. Their egos got in the way. Everybody wants to be in charge. You have the fight to be who's in charge. The fight over whose decisions. So it's really about power. It's about power. It's about control. About being able, even in the face of something that is so catastrophic and so dangerous, people still have to exert their control over other people. And that's one of the big problems with the film. I think what Romero is saying is that instead of working together, you have people that are jockeying for who's going to be right. That becomes even more important. Rather than who is going to be most pragmatic about these things and most selfless in being able to help everybody. No, who's going to be right? Who's going to be the top man? I think at one point, right, Ben even says something like, "You're the boss downstairs, I'm the boss up here."
Yeah.
And there should be no bosses. It should be like we should be working together and not be concerned about, well, who's going to be listened to? Whose authority is going to be validated?
Even though arguably Ben is the protagonist and Harry Cooper's the antagonist, when you think about it, Harry Cooper did have some good points. Technically, by the end of the film, he was right.
Absolutely, right? It is Ben survives because
he went down to the basement.
Exactly.
But I think the issue is Harry Cooper was also an asshole.
Right.
So I think maybe the movie's trying to say, just don't be a freaking asshole. Like,
no, yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
I think arguably they both had good points, and if they worked together, they probably could have pulled through together. But the problem is, neither one was willing to work together. And even though Ben's the one you root for, even he was in the wrong in some regards too.
See, and I think that's where, if you're going to find any racial kind of commentary in the film, maybe that's the racial commentary. That a black man and a white man aren't able to work together to solve a problem that threatens both of them.
Yeah.
I think that's where you could maybe make the racial kind of interpretation. But again, I think it goes beyond just race. I think it goes to this idea that human beings, look at what we're doing, environmentally, look what we're doing politically, socially, any number of threats to our existence, and people aren't able to put those things aside. And especially the fact about ego. They're not able to say, something, I'm wrong. Or, something, wow, that's a better idea. You actually came up with a better idea than I did. Mm-hmm. Right? Can't do that. Got to be the strong man. Got to be the person that's in charge.
Yeah.
Got to be the person that's the authority figure.
So far, we've only really talked about Harry Cooper and Ben. What do you think of some of the other characters?
Well, Barbara, of course, right?
Yeah,
and it's interesting. I guess when we talk about the remake, about the substantial changes that were made to her characterization in the film, it's interesting because I almost think that in some ways Barbara is the audience surrogate.
All right.
Right? Like we're sitting there, like the same way that we're watching the events unfold, Barbara does too, right? And she's kind of very passive in watching. So in some ways, I think she's almost like the audience surrogate for us. Like that's the character we're supposed to sort of connect with in the sense of that, she's passive and observing, we're passive and observing, and there's nothing we can do, and it seems like nothing she can do either.
Well, she is the first one we're introduced to, her and her brother Johnny, and while she's arguably one of the most iconic characters from the film, I always felt she was kind of a weak character, but she is sympathetic because when you think about it, a lot of people would be in her position where you're seeing these things that aren't supposed to be happening. a lot of people would probably go into a catatonic state after.
Sure, and she loses her brother too. She sees her brother killed in front of her.
Yeah.
But I think talking about how you said that she's the first character we introduced to, that I think was one of the most brilliant sequences in the film. That opening sequence where they drive out to the cemetery. Because one of the things I think that Romero does really well there is that he uses their conversation, which seems like a very natural conversation between brother and sister, to really bring up a lot of subconscious fears that we have about death, about being forgotten, right?
Yeah.
About going out to the cemetery, how it's become almost a ritual, that it's not, that the dead are forgotten, that there are things that are sort of cast aside, there are things that are sort of pushed to the periphery in our lives. And I think that really, that's not really sort of said that explicitly, but the conversation they have about having to drive so far out. And there's the thing about, where I think Johnny says something about the grave decorations.
Yeah.
Do they just use the same ones? Do they just resell them? How sort of death has become something that is on the periphery. It's become something that just makes money. It's not something that has become, that's central in people's lives anymore. Whereas maybe like, in the early 1900s, even in, previous to that, death was something that was central in people's lives, in terms of people dying, the low mortality rate, something that you lived with. You lived with death. Now, not so much anymore. It's definitely been sort of isolated, seen as abject and sort of and pushed to very specific places where it's okay to interact with the dead. And that's what makes the film so horrible, because here you have the dead in sort of breaking out of their prescribed places, right? Dead people should be in the graveyard, right? Dead people should be on coroner's tables. Dead people should be, or sick or decaying people should be, not in public, not coming out of those things coming at us. I think that's what makes the film really so scary, right? Is that the dead leave their prescribed areas. The areas where dead people should be in, they no longer sort of respect those boundaries.
Yeah.
They break past that.
And there's you just made me think of, there's a certain moment when Barbara's praying at her father's grave, and Johnny's like, "Hey, praying's for church," and she's like, "I haven't seen you in church lately." He's like, "Ain't much sense in I going to church." And I wonder if that was meant to be some kind of statement about the state of religion at the time.
It could be, and it could be again the idea of certain things are for their prescribed places, right? What does Johnny say? Johnny says praying's for church. So in other words, you should not be praying outside of the prescribed area where that's okay, right? Praying is the only, the place where it's validated is in church, right? And here you're doing it outside of church, there's something wrong. And he calls her on it. Same thing with death. Same thing with a lot of these metaphysical, aspects of the film, is that they're out of their prescribed places, right? Prayer should be in church. Dead people should be in coffins and graveyards. Women should be somewhere. Men should be somewhere. Children should not be killing their parents, raising up from the dead and killing their mother.
Yeah.
So again, I think it's a very much a film about things that should be in their rightful places that will not stay in those places and break out of that, and that's the horror of it.
Although what I was actually thinking of wasn't this around the time there was that article, I think, was it Time Magazine that had an article that basically asked, "Is God dead?"
Right, which again was, remember, it's in Rosemary's Baby, which is another revolutionary film that came out in 1968.
Yeah.
That was a major part of that too. No, absolutely, right, because again, you had this, again, tremendous changes happening in American society. Whereas, 1950, the difference between 1958 and 1968 was tremendous. It was only 10 years, and you had so many different radical new ideas and new sort of movements that came out of that, So you had people that were rejecting traditional forms of authority. So things like the church, right? All of a sudden now you have people rejecting that and saying, hey, the government rejecting that, saying, what are we doing in Vietnam is wrong, the lack of protection for civil rights activists. And so there was a lot of things going on at the time. So, again, that's why I think this is such a great movie about sort of overturning, because you have dead people coming out of their graves, overturning the most basic sort of structure of humanity, right? Is that there are, dead people and there are alive people, right? That's a major sort of way of looking at the world. One is dead, one is alive. One moves, one does not move. But all of a sudden now we have dead people that move. So you have this sort of total upheaval, total upending of what we expected society to be. The structures of society have been upended. So again, I really think that reflects a lot of other structures, maybe not as universal as life and death being overturned, but you have things like religion, you have things like marriage, you have things like politics and race, and so many things that were being upended, during this time.
Now, I do want to talk about how the film itself was, and Romero even admitted this, that it was basically a ripoff of Richard Matheson's I Am Legend. It's kind of an unofficial adaptation of I Am Legend, only instead of vampires, it's zombies, and instead of just one person against the undead, it's a group of people against the undead.
Yeah, I mean, I can definitely see that. I can definitely see that. Because, again, Matheson's is another, that novel, again, is about one way of life supplanting an older way of life, right? One way of living supplanting another, you know what I mean? So again, it makes a lot of sense that there are connections in that way. But I'm glad that he didn't do that adaptation, because I think Night of the Living Dead, by adding in the sort of the human element of the conflict within the house, very different than what happens to in I Am Legend, right? Two very different takes on sort of the human condition.
Yeah.
So I'm glad that they both exist. But yeah, I can definitely see that. I often wondered if Richard Matheson ever commented on Night of the Living Dead.
I think he did, and from what I heard, he actually wasn't a fan.
Oh, wow. Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I do want to point out that I Am Legend did already have a film adaptation before this called The Last Man on Earth. And it's funny, in The Last Man on Earth, even though that came out before Night of the Living Dead, the vampires in that look a lot like the zombies do in this movie.
No, absolutely. I often wondered if Romero if that was an influence on it, because even the look of The Last Man on Earth, that black and white, grainy, stark, documentary almost kind of look, is very much you see in Night of the Living Dead. And I also often wondered because the zombies in Night of the Living Dead also kind of remind me of the ghoul in Carnival of Souls.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm wondering if, and again, the look of Carnival of Souls, that black and white, stark sort of look of it, very similar to Night of the Living Dead. Now, I don't know if that was just because low budget films at the time took on that look because of the money that was available, the resources that was available, or was that a conscious decision that Romero made to sort of to make the film look aesthetically like those other two films.
And I do want to point out how this was such a revolutionary film for the horror genre, because technically, invented zombie films as we know them now, because definition of zombie is very wide, and there were zombie movies before it. If you really think about it, Frankenstein is kind of a zombie movie, because the Frankenstein monster is technically a reanimated corpse. But then, voodoo zombies, I Walked with a Zombie and White Zombie.
I Eat Your Skin, I think that was another early one, too.
Yeah, so zombie films existed before Night of the Living Dead, but this was the first zombie film that created that idea, that concept that if you get bitten by a zombie, you become a zombie, and now people associate zombies more with something plague-like, or something biological.
Right.
This invented the whole plague zombie genre and the zombie apocalypse genre, for want of a better term.
Absolutely. I also think it was revolutionary because it's one of the few horror films that had a downbeat ending. You think of most horror films had more moral endings, or endings in which the evil is defeated or at least banished for a while, But the ending, this is a really downbeat ending where the hero is not rewarded for his heroism at the end of the movie. I think I'm thinking of the only other one in Black Sabbath, Mario Bava's film, the Wunderlack, that sequence, where you have sort of a downbeat ending where the hero sort of isn't rewarded or else is actually defeated,
And that you could relate that to I Am Legend too, because of what happens to Neville at the end of I Am Legend.
Well, I guess again it depends on which side of the fence you're on to decide if that's a heroic ending or not. If you're on the vampire side, then that is a heroic ending, right? They actually got rid of this guy was murdering them, that was slaughtering them. The last vestiges of the old world, they're finally gone. So again, I guess perspective is important there.
If you really think about it, Night of the Living Dead was probably just as influential as something like Jaws or Star Wars. Definitely. Because I see on cars people have little stickers saying zombie response team, or there are internet memes saying I'm so ready for the zombie apocalypse or some crap like that, and it's half those people probably don't even realize all that stuff started with this movie.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think I think that really, it's probably, it really, to me, started I don't want to say modern horror, because obviously, but the modern sensibilities to horror.
Yeah.
It really brought that and Rosemary's Baby. I really think so, and it's interesting that they both came out in '68. Rosemary's Baby and Night of the Living Dead really brought a much more modern sensibility to horror films that were not beholden to folklore, or beholden to, sort of the old supernatural stories or like medieval concepts of good and evil and things like that. They're much more modern in the sense of how they're portraying what is horror, what is scary about these things. And it's interesting that both again, depending on your perspective, Rosemary's Baby ends, right, with it's a sort of a downbeat ending, but again, depending on what side you're on. If you're on the Satanist side, then hey, that's a great ending, but if you're on the sort of the traditional moral good side, it's a bad ending.
Well, I'm personally for that movie, I'm on Rosemary's side first and foremost.
Absolutely.
So whatever how you look at it from her point of view, that's how I interpret that ending. It's like, is it a positive ending? I mean, she's taking care of a baby who's the child of Satan, but you know what? It's her baby, and who knows? Maybe she'll find a way to raise it the way she wants to, not the way the Satanists want to raise the baby or something.
She's empowered, right?
Yeah.
In her marriage, she was not in the traditional family. She was not empowered. Her husband totally, sold her out. Totally exploited her. Well, maybe in this new family dynamic, right? She was actually going to be empowered. She will be the one that's actually the authority figure rather than her husband is. Yeah. But again, we can always talk about Rosemary's Baby another day. But have you heard that, supposedly I heard that they had actually found extra footage or something, that when they went to do the restoration of the film, that they actually found extra footage that was shot and that was cut out, deleted scenes and things like that. Have you heard that? Because I'm always wondering what I remember reading about it and then not hearing anything about it.
No, I never heard that, actually. Okay. I do... my aunt has this movie on DVD, but she has... Because the movie's in the public domain, you could basically do whatever you want with the movie, and somebody did like a re-edit of the film where they added new music, but also added new scenes that sort of explains how this is happening, and I didn't like that at all.
Yeah, it sounds horrible.
Yeah, it was. I was like, no, this is pretty bad. And then because it's public domain, you have a I can't say the word right now, colorized version of the movie, and like there's a bunch of different edits out there, because technically, I could probably take this movie and release it on DVD.
Right.
Yeah.
It's funny because you mentioned the new score. I love the original score, even though I know it's all library tracks, all tracks that that he bought that were already performed by anonymous musicians or whatever, and they're uncredited, I think, in the film. But I love the soundtrack to this. It's just so great. I think it's great because I love the use of silence and natural sounds, but I also love the sort of the music. It just gives it such a sort of such a weird vibe to the whole film.
Honestly, one of the creepiest scenes in the movie is actually the scene where Barbara touches that music box, and the music box, for some reason, that scene does really creep me out.
Yeah, that's a great scene.
Yeah.
And it's an unexpected scene because it's you're expecting, because you know the threat that's out there and what's going on, and you're trying to figure out what's going on, and there's that moment of sort of gentle revelry, in that moment. That's a really, that movie just shows you, right from the get-go, Romero was an amazing filmmaker. He didn't need X amount of films to progress and get his style or to learn the ropes. Man, he was such a genius right from the beginning. Beginning.
The scene where Helen's daughter comes back to life as a zombie and kills her with the what do they call that gardening?
Oh, what do they call that? Not something with a T, I think. Trowel?
Yeah, trowel. And when she kills her with that, and that's a terrifying scene, and the music that plays is so freaking creepy on that.
I've also heard that that's sort of people have seen symbolism in that about what was going on in 1968 with the rebellion of children against their parents because of the hippie movement and the anti-war movement. So I've read also interpretations that's symbolic of sort of the youth of America sort of fighting back or striking back at their, at the elders in society. But again, who knows? That could be just, again, more people just putting their perspective on things rather than it just being just a terrifying scene. Mm-hmm. To show you that once you become a zombie, any alliances you have or any connections you have with the living are totally severed. The Cooper's marriage.
Yeah.
You could tell that they've had a lot of problems, that the zombie apocalypse did not start their problems in their marriage. You could just tell by the way they interact with each other that they've probably had a lot of problems in their marriage. This was just one more, issue, one more sort of, bump in the road of their marriage.
We're going to be moving on to Dawn of the Dead pretty soon, but real quick, any words on the 1990 remake?
Yeah, I mean, I enjoyed it a lot. I mean, obviously, remaking a classic is so tough, But I really think that Tom Savini did a really good job, Again, is it better than the original? No, no way near it. But I still think it's very respectable. It's a film that I did enjoy a lot. I thought the effects were great. I thought the acting for the most part was really good. I thought Tony Todd was great. I loved the recharacterization of
Barbara.
Barbara.
Yeah.
I thought that was really interesting. So yeah, I enjoyed it very much. Like I said, do I think it's better than the original? No, but I still think it's a worthy successor. I think and it was updated in a respectful but also interesting way.
Yeah, I love that one personally, but I love it, but at the same time, I still prefer this one. Even though I do think Barbara was a much better character in the remake than she was in this movie. Overall, though, I still kind of prefer the original 1968 film.
Right.
Now, I haven't watched this, but have you seen that freaking... They did another remake with Sid Haig.
I have not seen it. No, I know what you're talking about, but I did not see it.
Yeah, I never seen it. I have it, but I never bothered to watch it. Here's my friend Chris giving his thoughts on the original Night of the Living Dead, and he also gives some of his thoughts on the 1990 remake.
So we're talking about the immortal classic, Night of the Living Dead. I think the first thing that we really got to dip into is the subtext, which there's been so much debate over exactly what it's trying to say and what themes it's exploring. I think personally, it's really just about the paranoia of the time, between race, between what was going on in politics, just in general, paranoia about what could be right outside your door, or what could come to you rather than it happening in another country or somewhere else in the world. The idea that at any moment something could break out, I think that's what's so scary about zombies. I remember Max Brooks, the guy who wrote World War Z, he sort of articulated it so well. He goes, the thing that's scary about zombies is that they come to you. It's not the normal horror thing where you go to a haunted house or you go to, a summer camp, an abandoned summer camp, or, the usual stuff where, you do something stupid, you end up in a place that is very obviously haunted or, being stalked by a killer or something like that. In terms of zombies, they're just a huge pandemic that is going to spread and is going to go everywhere. But the interesting thing that you see in this one is they're proto-zombies. They're not quite following the rules of zombies as we know them today. They literally are just living dead. They're a lot more alive than what zombies later became. I feel like Dawn of the Dead was what really kind of established the rules of zombies as Romero kind of refined it. Here, they're more people who just came out of their graves and they're in this kind of rabid state. The scene where he comes after Barb in the car, the first zombie we see, and he's trying to break down the window, and the way he attacks Johnny and her is really unconventional. And then later, of course, the scene where the daughter in the basement who dies partway through the film, and they're trying to take care of her and all that stuff, she stabs her mother with a trowel, which is not anything a zombie would do. But here's the interesting thing. It's almost, I feel like in retrospect, maybe he was setting this up for the future, because the later Dead films, as we'll get into, they started to establish that zombies were starting to gain intellect and were starting to figure out how to interact with things and how to set traps and how to sneak up on people. A really good example would be Bubba from Day of the Dead, which again we'll get to later, but how intuitive he gets is almost evocative of the way zombies behaved in this movie. The remake, which I know in a lot of reviews I've been doing for Christian lately, I've been bringing up remakes of original films, but I do think they are worth bringing up, especially if I do feel they added something. And honestly, the Night of the Living Dead remake I think is awesome. And personally, for me, that there's been a bunch of versions of the story now. I do think it is that is the definitive version of the story, because the zombies in that movie play by the rules that get established for zombies later on. They're slow walking, they're biters. They're not aggressive, but they are kind of, in a flock, they are essentially one huge virus. You do have to be wary of them. And obviously the rewrites that they did for Barb in that one really establishes her as a much better character than she was in the original. Ben dies just as tragically as he did in the original. The dad's still an asshole. They still do the mother-daughter death, but it's of a bite this time, obviously. But they do give it the little shout-out when the blood hits the trowel on the wall. So definitely check that movie out if you haven't seen it. It's very underrated, at least in my opinion. I enjoy it a lot. But back to the original. Talking about the subtext again, the idea that these things could just come, and these things, we don't know what caused it. There's no explanation for why the dead are coming back. They just are, and they're spreading, and they're going everywhere. And it was just evocative of the time, because the idea that, something could just go down, something could just happen, and it could just come for you for no reason whatsoever other than the simple fact that you were there. I think that's a very scary idea, and one that George really pulled off so well with these proto versions of zombies that are a little bit more intelligent, but are still very kind of rabid and obviously, still slow shuffling. So there's a reason why this is such kind of a groundbreaking movie, and part of it is because even though they are still the proto-zombies, this was the first time that zombies were portrayed in this way. It used to be like you had to fly to Haiti, and like voodoo had to be involved, and it was like a curse, and somebody sent these things after you. This was simply, they're coming, and there's no reason, and you have to watch out for them, which is a much scarier idea. The idea that like you didn't do anything, and these things are still gonna fuck with you. So it is an iconic movie. There's no denying it. It's amazing. It kind of set the template for horror for a long time, especially obviously zombie movies. And it's something I really love is just how dark the ending is. Like just nobody gets out. Nobody made it, and the people in authority are implied to be somewhat incompetent, or at the very least, ruthless. Because the scene where they kill Ben without even double checking whether or not he's one of them, there's something very profound being said there that I think is just trying to say, okay, well, if this does happen, how fucked are we in terms of the people who have to clean it up? And should we put so much faith in the people that are supposed to be taking care of us and the people who are supposed to help us and protect us? Or if this happens, should we just say fuck it and call martial law? Should we just make it all house rules and just do our own thing and not have to rely on military and the people who are supposed to take care of us? Because another interesting thing is, as these movies go on, the military slowly starts to morph into its own separate villain, especially by the time of like Diary of the Dead, which obviously I'll get to much later. It's interesting. It's very interesting to think about, and he's raising some really cool questions with this, and that's why it's such an iconic movie. It's like a freaky, spooky little zombie flick, but it is asking some interesting questions about institutions and what would you do if this happened, if you were in this situation, and would you have the resolve that Ben has? Would you be level-headed? Would you be resilient? Would you try to make it to daylight? Or would you be like Barb, where you would just fold and just, like completely fall to pieces and, just accept your fate? So it's personal in that way, but it's exploring broad themes. I love that it works on both levels, and that's why it's such a classic movie. And I really hope that its brilliance is never forgotten, because it deserves its place in sort of the pantheon of film.
Here's my friend John giving his thoughts on the original Night of the Living Dead.
Night of the Living Dead, even though like it's a great horror movie, but I'm not really a huge fan of like the zombie genre. I mean, it's not like I'm against it. I feel like each like horror like zombie genre is just like the same thing over and over again, but definitely George Romero's Night of the Living Dead is definitely one of the best of zombie films. When I first saw this movie, I'm thinking to myself, this was definitely not a common thing you saw back in the 60s, seeing a black guy play the hero in a film. it was pretty interesting to see something different for the first time, especially at that time when there was like civil rights going. At that time, Martin Luther King and RFK were assassinated. Oh yeah, I think Dwayne Jones does a great job as Ben, because like he's like everyone else in the movie, trying to survive and trying to like see if he can like get out of this situation, being trapped in a house with zombies. And oh yeah, one fact about Night of the Living Dead. This past summer, as I told you, I worked on a movie that I don't remember the actress's name, but she knew Dwayne Jones very well and personally, because he taught at Westbury College, like towards the end of his life. It may be somewhat of a flawed film, but it's still definitely worth checking out. It's still like a great like horror zombie film to watch, because of showing that George Romero was saying, "Hey, we can make a movie no matter what our budget is."
This is my friend Nick giving his thoughts on the original Night of the Living Dead.
So George A. Romero's Night of the Living Dead, 1968. So I'm not going to sit here and really argue about as to how influential this film was or how important it was, not only for the zombie film genre, but in the horror genre and for film in general. I think that's been really said, and many people are in agreement of how important this film was. I really, instead of like to share kind of a personal anecdote with the film, and what this film meant to me and how I got introduced to it. So I think I was about 5 or 7 years old, and my friend Matt had moved away, and I was very sad and very upset. So my mom, to kind of make me feel better, decided to purchase me a bunch of films, or rent me a bunch of films, I think. And there's probably like 7 or 8 movies, some of them horror, some of them not. I couldn't tell you what they all were, but I could tell you that Night of the Living Dead was one of them. It was at the bottom of the pile. So I watched all of them, and then I got to Night of the Living Dead, and I looked at the back cover and looked at the front, and I said, I'm not going to watch this because it's in black and white, and at the time, as a little kid, black and white is crap, and it's probably horrible and made horribly, and, all these assumptions as a little kid I made about this film. So I returned the pile to my mom, and I said, hey, we can take these back to the video store now. Thank you so much. I feel a lot better and everything. So she said, did you watch all of the movies? And I said, yeah, I watched all the movies. So she said, what did you think of Night of the Living Dead? What was your opinion about that? And I froze, and she said, you didn't watch it, did you? So I fessed up and said I didn't watch it. So at that point, she goes into the cabinet and pulls out a bag of popcorn and begins making it, and says, you have to sit down and watch this movie. So I did, and with a little reluctance, I was a little annoyed. I didn't want to watch it. And then, by the time it was done, my jaw was to the floor. I couldn't believe how impactful that film was, and how much of a ride it was, and how entertaining it was, and the messages that George was trying to say in 1968, and such an influential film for me. I think if I had to pick one film that really started my love of the horror genre and film in general, it would be Night of the Living Dead. It just was so, approachable, and you felt like, if they could make this movie about, these zombies over, in these ghouls, as they called them in the film, kind of surrounding this home and attacking the home, and felt like, maybe I could make a movie like that, or maybe I could get into film or do something like that. It just seemed like film was approachable, that kind of guerrilla filmmaking style that George had. And subsequently, I became obsessed with film and obsessed with learning behind the scenes and who was responsible for making these movies, and such started my love of not only the horror genre, but conventions and meeting celebrities. So Night of the Living Dead was really critical and a major portion of my middle school and high school life. So without George and that film, I wouldn't know how my high school or middle school life would have kind of happened, so to speak. And my late mother, who had passed away, this was something that we shared together, this film and our love for it. So ultimately, thanks, George. It was an amazing, amazing film that you made. I miss you dearly. I got a chance to meet George a few times, and I expressed to him how much this film meant to me. which was super, super awesome. So again, I'm not going to really get into like a big review as to why this film is amazing, because I think a lot of people are in agreement, whether or not you like it or not, a lot of people are at least in agreement how impactful it was and how important it was in the genre. So that's my little personal anecdote of Night of the Living Dead 1968.
Yeah, so now let's move on to Dawn of the Dead, the 1978 sequel to Night of the Living Dead. Even though people debate whether it's a sequel or not, I consider it a sequel. Like, I could still buy that it's in the same universe happening, like, because it's supposed to be arguably maybe a week or so after the events of the first film, but there's a timeline issue there because the first movie clearly takes place when it came out, 1968. And then Dawn of the Dead clearly takes place in 1978, yet they're supposed to be in the same universe and are supposed to be just within a few days of each other. But I still I can almost forgive that timeline discrepancy because I still like to think of this as a sequel to Night of the Living Dead, but at the same time, it's a sequel that you don't have to watch the first one in order to get this.
And I think, and I remember being a kid and something, it's like people weren't as obsessed with continuity back then as people now are, like, so obsessed with continuity. So, yeah, I mean, I totally see it. It could be a few days after. That's fine.
Yeah.
I don't see any... It doesn't affect my ability to appreciate either of the films or to see the sort of the symbolic connections between them, which I think are much more important than the continuity connections between them.
Because I've always read, like, those... When they're in the helicopter... going over that field with all the rednecks shooting the zombies, I always viewed those characters, those rednecks, as being part of the same group that we saw in the first one.
Sure, absolutely.
Because I think they're in the same area and stuff. But I guess it's up to you whether these films are really connected. But even if it's not a continuity-based sequel, it's definitely a spiritual sequel or a thematic sequel.
Very much so, yeah.
Yeah. But Dawn of the Dead is a classic freaking movie. I adore this film, and I do think it's a better film than the original. As much as I do love the first movie, I do like this better. It's a film I find myself watching more often.
Well, I also think Romero matured as an artist and matured as a thinker. Like, he's just an intellectual. So 10 years is a long time. So he's going to, he matured and he probably got, he got more critical and more intellectual. And it's like, it shows,
Yeah. Although I will say, because a lot of the social commentary in the first film was kind of accidental, because of that, the social commentary in the first film was a little more subtle, where here, as much as I love the film, the commentary is kind of on the nose, I would say.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think so. I also think, too, it's like... because it's more of a satire, so that makes more sense. Where I think in the first film, I don't think there was anything satirical about the first film.
Yeah.
The Dawn of the Dead is much more satirical and it's much more comedic. So that kind of makes sense to me that it'd be a little bit more on the nose, and I don't mind it at all.
That's something I love about the film, though, is this is one of my favorite, like, films that combines genres, because it's a horror film, but it's also a black comedy, it's a satire, it's a drama, it's an action film. It's actually, I consider this one of the greatest action films ever made. It's all these different genres all rolled together into one film.
Yeah, that's very true,
Yeah.
And yeah, it's a drama, you really feel for the characters. You get to know them really well.
Actually, I would argue of all of Romero's Dead films, this is the one that has the best characterization.
Yes, I would
because
agree with that.
you really, every time I watch this film, I feel like I'm a fifth person in this group. Like, I feel like I actually know these people, and like the scene where Roger gets bit. Every time I watch this movie,
yeah, I hate that scene.
Yeah, but because like I'm rooting for him to get out of there,
Exactly.
I'm like, come on, and I know what's gonna happen, but I'm still like hoping, oh please get out, because I love these characters a lot.
Very much so. And they're all distinct too. They're like, they have distinct personalities. They have this, so they're not they're not just sort of just faceless fodder for the zombies to get at. They're really, and they're adults too. I think that's another thing too that I really like about Romero's Dead series is that they're adult characters. They're real adult characters. They're not teenagers. They're not ciphers. They're not people just to be thrown to the zombies or whatever. They're like real people with real problems and real issues and
Yeah,
real
because teenagers
personalities.
aren't real people.
No, yeah, you can tell I'm a teacher by my anti-teenage stance. But anyway, but to me, it's just that they're really well written, mature characters, and it's something that you don't. Unfortunately, you see less and less of in horror films.
Yeah. And, we should probably talk a little bit more about the social commentary in the film. It's mainly making a statement about consumerism and putting value on things that, in this situation, really wouldn't have value anymore. Mm-hmm. But I also saw, there's definitely sort of a commentary on gender issues, like with Fran, where at one point Fran says, look, I'm not going to be a den mother for you guys, and you could tell, while they're not saying it flat out, they do kind of look down on her because she's a woman, so, you could tell in that one scene, she's, kind of asserting herself, saying, look, I'm equal here, and I deserve to be part of the plans. I deserve to know what's going on.
And she wants to learn how to drive the helicopter. She wants, yeah, absolutely. I think that's really good, and that becomes even more fraught when you find out she's pregnant.
Yeah,
right. That becomes it makes it even more. And it's the irony of her saying she doesn't want to be a den mother. Yeah, she's going to be a mother.
Yeah,
because she is pregnant. But yeah, and like I said, they're very complex relationships. There's very complex issues going on amongst these characters, even outside of the fact that there's a zombie apocalypse. Yeah. And again, that's something I really like about the film, because you have the inner drama of the relationships within the mall, within the small group, but then you always keep in mind that outside of that, there's even bigger issues. There's world, changing issues going on around them.
Mm-hmm. I do like how this really does show the zombie apocalypse on more of a global scale, whereas in the first one, it was implied that it was happening all over the world, but you didn't know for sure, and you weren't sure if maybe this could have been stopped. Whereas in this one, it's happening all over the world, and there's probably no way humanity's going to stop this.
Yeah, especially in the opening sequences, you really see how things are breaking down. Yep. When they're in the TV station.
Oh yes,
which I think is really good too, because you get like you said, you get a larger perspective on sort of how this affects not just in Dawn of the Night of the Living Dead. It was only how it affected the people in that farmhouse.
Yeah,
here you get a much greater understanding of how it's affecting everybody across society.
That opening scene is one of my favorite scenes in any horror film, because it's how I would imagine an actual news station if the world ever ended. People would be flowing the coop. People would be getting the hell out of there. But then there would be people saying, no, we need to stay and finish this. I think there's a line in that scene where somebody says we're blowing it ourselves, which really does. Actually, you gave me the novelization of Dawn of the Dead, which really does give you an interesting perspective on the story if you read the novelization, that if you think about it, if people put aside their own bullshit, they probably could have dealt with this problem.
And that's, if you're going to look at one theme that runs through the tetralogy, of the four films, that's it, right? That's really the main theme that runs through all four of the films, in the core films, is this idea of human beings cannot get along with each other, right? And even in the face of death, this predatory death that's coming at you, where we should all be getting together. We should look at the world in very simple terms. Either you're a zombie or you are a human being. People still can't do that.
Yeah,
they still can't do that. Mm-hmm. And I think that really, you could see that in all four of the films, and it's always to the detriment of human beings. The zombies always win. By us being divided, it just makes the zombies that much easier for the zombies to consume us and make more zombies.
Yeah.
One of the scenes that I love in the film, probably my favorite scene, is the whole tenement building scene.
Oh yes,
with the SWAT team. That's just an amazing scene. Yeah. Those scenes are unbelievable, because you feel so bad for the people that live in that tenement, because obviously they love those people and they don't want to let go of their loved ones, because they still think they are salvageable, and there's so many emotions going on in those scenes, because you have the SWAT team people that are they're nervous and they're getting themselves pumped up to go in here and do this, and who are they going to shoot, the zombies, or by mistake they're shooting regular people?
Some of it wasn't a mistake. You had that one guy who was clearly a racist, right, and he was clearly enjoying blowing off the Puerto Rican and black people's heads off and stuff.
Absolutely, so they're so fraught with so many emotions. It's so tension filled.
Yeah, and I love when that they find that priest who has one leg, and I think that's Martinez, right?
Right.
That the one they were actually going after, who was keeping all those people there, and he has that great line: "We must stop the killing or lose the war."
Yeah, I mean, that whole sequence is great when you first meet Ken Foray's character, and it's just a masterful scene, and you really see how incredible of a filmmaker Romero is.
Yeah.
By achieving so many things in that, and it's not that long of a sequence, you know, but he achieves so many things. He establishes characters, he establishes what's going on about how people are reacting to this, how they're trying to still keep their humanity and still keep their loved ones, even though there's so many things going on in these scenes, and he's able to orchestrate it in such a way that it doesn't seem like confused or convoluted. You know, it seems very natural, and he's just to be able to take such a fantastic subject and make it seem natural. That's a real gift. Like, that's a real skill.
Yeah, and I just love like how this movie kind of really does fuck around with tone, and you don't care, like because it's a drama film. It's a great horror film too, but there is a lot of humor in this. Like, honestly, the scene towards the end where the biker gang comes to the mall, I find to be one of the most hilarious sequences in any movie. And you don't care that you have this really funny sequence in a film that also has really good character drama.
And really brutal violence in some ways, and really, graphic scenes of that violence as well.
But even that scene, while I said it's one of the funniest scenes in any movie, it also ends really horribly for a lot of those bikers.
Absolutely.
And even like at the end when you think Peter's gonna shoot himself and he doesn't, and they play like the superhero music, technically that shouldn't work, but somehow it does.
Right, yeah, absolutely.
And I actually do like how this one is a little less nihilistic than Night of the Living Dead. Right. As much as I love the nihilism of the first film, I kind of liked that this one did have a slightly happier ending, even though that's debatable too, because they were low on gas when they got out of there, so you don't know what happens to them after this.
No, absolutely. And, I mean, so many of the scenes in the film have become so iconic. You know, and symbols in the film, like the zombie who gets the top of his head chopped off with the rotary blades of the helicopter, the Hare Krishna zombie. You know, the whole part where they're sort of like emptying the mall of the zombies, and they're running around and doing everything. Like, it's just like so many great sequences in this film. It's amazing, you know. And it's funny because, you know, no matter what cut you see, because, you know, there's multiple cuts of the film, it still holds together. I mean, there's some cuts that I think are better than the other cuts, but it doesn't matter. Like, there's some films that, like, the different cuts that are vastly different, and one cut is so much better than the other cuts. In this movie, I think they're all really good.
Yeah. I do want to talk to you a little bit about the different cuts of the film, because the only one I've seen all the way through is the U.S. theatrical cut, so I've never seen the extended version.
Yeah, that's the one that he put together to show at Cannes, when he went to Cannes Film Festival, I guess, to drum up support or additional money, or to get distributors to be interested in it. Yeah, and he hadn't cut the film, so he just kind of put something together to bring over to Cannes, and that has like a lot of additional scenes and stuff.
I've only seen parts of the Argento version, which was called Zombie over in Italy.
Right, yeah, and it has much more of the Goblin. Yeah, I think maybe all the Goblin score in it, which I love, and the Goblin score is amazing.
Heard that the Argento cut kind of removes a lot of the social commentary.
Yeah, it does. I think it does. Also, too, it also removes some of the gore, which I thought was interesting. Like the sequence was like one of the most iconic sequences when the zombie gets the top of his head chopped off because of the rotary blades. Like, that's not in the Argento cut. And I thought that was really odd, an odd choice to make, to sort of remove that. But yeah, I mean, I like all three of the cuts. I mean, I think the theatrical cut probably is the best cut of the film, but I really love the extended cut because I love this movie so much. I want to see as much footage as possible. But I mean, and then that's one of the reasons why I even read the novelization, because I wanted to find out. And the novelization is really interesting because it has that has a nihilistic ending, you know, with the suicides, right?
Actually, no. From what I remember, the novelization's ending was pretty similar to the movie's ending. I know in the original script...
Oh, maybe that's what I'm thinking of.
It had the suicides.
Okay, yeah. Right.
No, but the novelization was pretty true to the movie.
Okay, that's cool.
The one thing the novelization did include is that there's a pet store in the mall. And I'm like, oh, that's kind of sad, because when those zombies get in there, those pets are effed.
Yeah, right. Yeah, they're going to be eaten, or starved to death, right, if nobody's been taking care of them. And, of course, the setting of the mall is just brilliant. That's just such a great... that's just a great setting to have. But
it also adds to the social commentary in the film.
Absolutely. And Mike doesn't, at one point, one of them, they're like, why are the zombies coming here? And I can, one of the characters is like there's
This
something
was-
in their mind that
This was an important place in their lives.
right. And again, it's just funny that it wasn't. I don't even know if mall culture is still as big as it used to be now with like online shopping and things like that. But mall culture was huge, like in the 80s and even into the early 90s. It was huge, And so to use the mall, which at the time was seen as such a fun place, and again in the late 70s, I mean malls like that were pretty new and modern, and to turn them into places of like where horrors could happen at them, was pretty revolutionary.
There's a line in the film when they're watching the TV. This is before the stations go dead, and you had that one scientist with the eye patch. He's like, "We have to remain rational," and then the guy he's talking to on the TV says, "Scientists always think like that. That's not how people really are," and that was such a profound statement.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I also think that's also reflected in Romero's film The Crazies.
Yeah.
Right. That's another film about sort of the breakdown of a part of society, at least.
I'll admit I've actually never seen any of the Romero films between Night and this movie,
Okay.
so I've never seen The Crazies or Martin or that movie There's Always Vanilla, which I know he's really not proud of.
Yeah, and there's also Jack's Wife, The Season of the Witch, that film too he made.
Yeah.
Which are all really interesting films,
How are some of those films?
Yeah, I mean, well, I think Martin's his greatest film. So,
Okay.
I'm like a huge fan of Martin. I think it's such an amazing film. So, I'm a huge fan of Martin. Jack's Wife is good. I think that people going in expecting it to be like this like supernatural witch film. No, it's really about this woman, this middle-aged woman who sort of realizes that she's really unhappy with her life and how she could start over, and she's unhappy with the roles that she's playing. And then There's Always Vanilla is more of like kind of like a counterculture, right? It's like a relationship between a guy and a girl, and so I mean, it's interesting that he tried to sort of extend outwards from being like just a sort of horror director, but clearly in the films that he's made, horror was his genre, and that was what he really sort of brought his A game to.
Can't neglect Argento's role in this movie. I think he really did. He's part of the reason why this movie was made, pretty much.
Yeah, absolutely, right. And there's a story, right? He let Romero use his apartment for 2 weeks or something like that in Rome to be able to write out the script.
Yeah.
I mean that's Argento, of course, would always be remembered as one of the great horror directors to begin with. But his producing, if you think about some of the things he's produced, like the Demons films and Dawn of the Dead and the Michele Soavi films. I mean, he's really been an amazing force in horror on the directing side, on the creating side, but also on helping other people create great horror as well.
Before we move on to Day of the Dead, any words on the Zack Snyder remake?
I thought it was okay. It was entertaining. I think that it doesn't hold a candle, of course, to the original, but it was an entertaining movie. I thought he did bring a couple of interesting twists on things, the whole zombie baby kind of thing, and he had some good actors in it, which were really good. I thought Ving Rhames was really good, and Sarah Paulin was in it. So I mean, that was an enjoyable film, but obviously could not hold a candle to the original.
Yeah, I like that one. I appreciate that he didn't do a straight remake, that he made his own thing. And I think it's a pretty good movie. I still think Watchmen is probably Zack Snyder's best film.
Yeah, I would agree. I would agree with that.
And we should probably mention Lucio Fulci's Zombie, because that was called Zombie 2 in Italy, and it's technically an unofficial sequel to Dawn of the Dead, because Dawn of the Dead was called Zombie in Italy. But yeah, Lucio Fulci's Zombie is great.
Oh my god, it's awesome, yeah.
I mean, obviously, I don't count it as officially being part of the series, but it is technically an unofficial sequel, so that's why I wanted to give it a little mention.
Well, it's funny, because in Italy, I mean, Dawn of the Dead was huge. It was a huge film over there, and it really kickstarted the whole zombie, Italian zombie flicks over there, So, again, you got to really thank Dario Argento for doing that as well, even though he never made any Italian zombie films. If it wasn't for him and Dawn of the Dead, you probably would not have had that whole sort of subgenre of horror over in Italy, and really gave Fulci back his career.
Here's Chris giving his thoughts on the original Dawn of the Dead, and he also gives some of his thoughts on the 2004 remake.
So now we get to what I think is everybody's favorite, Dawn of the Dead, another classic. There's no denying it. This one, the thing about it is that the themes in the first one were a little more broad, and here you see him starting to refine it, because obviously the zombies are different now. They're the slow-moving biters. a little bit less aggressive, but still dangerous, especially in hordes. But the whole subtext about everything happening in a mall, obviously consumerism is what's up for grabs there. The idea of all the zombies trying to get into the mall before it opens, the biker gang coming along and just like all hell breaking loose when everything tries to. When you try to bring new people into the situation, often in horror films, that's where you see everything fall apart. And I think that's meant to be indicative of like how society works. Because if you got like a small group of people like it is in the film, where there's like 4 people just like huddled together in the mall, they have everything they need. They just got to watch out for zombies, And then, this whole other group of people show up and they just fuck everything up completely. But then comes the irony. Guess what? The zombies are us, and we're them. And these biker guys, same thing goes for them. So really, who is the villain here if everybody is, in theory, just a human? If it's all people, are the villains people? Is that really the message of these movies? That, honestly, there's nothing that's going to tear us apart any worse than ourselves. And I think that's something that a lot of people forget when it comes to these stories. I'm really fascinated by the concept of zombies and like the way that they would exist in real life and how this could possibly happen in the real world. But ultimately, it's all just a metaphor, like everything is in horror. Everything in horror is an extrapolation for real-world horror. A great example for this is obviously the biker gang. And also kind of this rift that starts to form between the husband and wife. Within the mall, there's just like this weird kind of silent animosity that just starts to form between them. And it's weird, that like all this stuff is going on, and it's just that they just end up in this like silent misery that is never quite spoken about, but is very obvious and is very palpable, and the audience feels it. And it's interesting to think that like all this crazy shit was going on, and yet the people, the person that you love the most in the world and you should be most comfortable around, there's something that just like falls out between you two. That's very odd and very, very weird to think about. I love Ken Foree in this movie. This is kind of what makes him an icon in this movie, because he plays a really great character. Him and his buddy, going up and down the escalators and stuff like that, and being able to get all the supplies they need and everything. You see that these are guys who know how to survive and know how to make it out of these situations. But even for them, it's tough. It's very, especially after he becomes incapacitated, his buddy. Then things kind of start taking a turn for the worse, and obviously people start turning within the group and stuff like that, and everything just slowly falls apart. And obviously there's a message there too about society. All it's going to take is one or two few things out of turn, and it's all going to fall apart, and it's all going to just go downhill. There's this moment that I really love when they're up in the helicopter and they're looking down, and the zombies are everywhere. And it really speaks to the kind of horde mentality of the whole thing. And I forget who it is that says it, but they just look down and they go, Jesus, it's everywhere. Like it's such a haunting little moment that speaks to, as much as we try to keep things in line and we try to, make sure that everybody's okay and is safe and secure. At any moment, it could all fall apart, and everything could just be completely fucked. And it's scary to think about. And again, that's kind of the message of these movies. Not only that it could all fall apart at the exact moment, but at like a minute moment, but that it could be us. It could just be our incompetence or our arrogance that tears everything down and makes us all just fall into like this fucked up apocalyptic cesspool. Very scary, and definitely sticks with you when you're done watching it. I just want to bring up the remake real quick, just because I'm trying to be as thorough as I can. I do like it. It's very fun to watch. I'm gonna piss some people off with this. I do like the idea of fast zombies. I think it's a very cool, very different way of exploring it and looking at zombies as a concept, because then it much more resembles the idea of a virus, spreading as fast as it can and very aggressively. It worked well for the remake, because if they were going to remake that movie, it was going to have to be in a way that looked at it through a different lens. And the way you look at it in the remake is, okay, here's how fast everything went to shit. It's not, there's a particular tipping point, there's like one or two few things that just like went out of line and everything fell over. No, this is, it bites you, you're gone, you're a fast-running zombie, and you're going to fuck other people up, and it's just going to spread, and it's going to go. That whole opening sequence is a serious, like, thrill ride. It's just like, the dead girl comes in, bites him, and it's just, everything just, like, goes from there, and it all goes to shit so fast. So I think that it ties back to the original in that way. But this time around, it's more aggressive. It's a crazier, more enthralling movie. I do enjoy it a lot, even though it's kind of, they do play it a little bit more for the entertainment value, but at the same time, it is yeah. There is subtext in that remake, as much as they're not really focusing on the consumerism angle or anything like that. They were having fun with it. And come on, that whole last third of the movie where they're in the armored buses and stuff, it's great. It's amazing. It's awesome horror. And I really like that remake. I have so much fun with it watching it. But yeah, when it comes to subtext, obviously you can't hold a candle to the original, and I do love the original. The debate whether or not it's better than Night, that's tough for me, honestly. I guess I don't know. I'd probably have to go with Dawn. I think I do like Dawn a little better. I think it just visually, it might be a more interesting movie, as much as like the stark black and white of the original was something very distinct. But yeah, I would have to say Dawn over the original. As for which is like my favorite one, we'll get to that later. It's an answer that might surprise you. But Dawn of the Dead, iconic, classic, you can't top it. Check it out if you haven't seen it.
Here's John's review on Dawn of the Dead.
This movie taught me that in case of an apocalypse happens, go to the mall. You got all your resources. I also love Ken Foree in the film. He was a badass. Remember that scene when he shoots the kids? That kind of was a little bit too hard and intense, but at the same time, you get the reason. It's not that he would do it in real life. It was like basically the point is that like when they're zombies, you have no choice but to shoot them anyway. I mean, that's just like anybody, like an adult, a kid. Yeah, in that situation, you gotta put them out of their misery. I also love Tom, even though like it was a brief part for Tom Savini, but it was pretty cool seeing him. And also just the part when the helicopter like chops the zombie's head out just shows don't always need a gun to kill a zombie.
Here are Nick's thoughts on Dawn of the Dead.
So George A. Romero's Dawn of the Dead, 1978. So like Night of the Living Dead, I'm not gonna really get into like a big review and kind of discuss any kind of analysis or anything like that about it. I'm really going to share, like Night of the Living Dead, more of a personal anecdote of this film and kind of what it means to me and where I first saw it and things like this. So I know people are going to give me crap for this, but as a kid, after Night of the Living Dead, I kind of, I started watching all of the Halloween films and Nightmare on Elm Street films and the Friday the 13th films. Even the Leprechaun films, Chainsaw Massacre, stuff like this. And I didn't even know, really, that, there was other films in the Dead trilogy. It wasn't until the Dawn of the Dead remake came out that I saw that, and I said, is there an original to this? So, then I looked it up, and I was like, wow, so there was a sequel to Night of the Living Dead, 1978. So I immediately had to run out and get this, and I got the Ultimate Edition, which is the 4-disc set, or 5-disc set. It comes with the 3 cuts, the theatrical cut, the European cut, and the director's cut. So I sat down and I watched all 3 of them, and I was equally blown away by all the cuts. They're subtly different in many ways, in terms of pacing and in terms of kind of tone and in terms of soundtrack, they're all kind of different. But if Night of the Living Dead was the movie that I watched and started me to be obsessed with film and really interested in film analysis and movie making and who's behind the scenes, it was Dawn of the Dead that made me want to be somebody behind the scenes, made me want to be a filmmaker, to work in the film business. And that's really, due to the fact that Dawn is just a really fun movie. It's a really fun movie to watch. I remember every day in high school I would come home and I would pick a movie to put in while I was just doing my homework. It's kind of like a background noise kind of thing, and 9 times out of 10 I plopped in Dawn of the Dead. Just a really fun movie, very entertaining, with social commentary. If you ask me, I think that this was George's masterpiece. We can't discredit Night, for starting the genre. And a lot of people love Day of the Dead for opposite reasons of Dawn. Day of the Dead is a lot more of a darker film. But I really like the warm kind of, color palette that George had in this film. And, the cowboys running around the mall, looting and having a good time. I had a good time watching it. So I think Dawn of the Dead is by far my favorite horror film. It's the one I always go to. It's the one where if someone hasn't seen it, I feel like I need to show them it because of how impactful and influential it was on me as a young kid. So yeah, that's my commentary on 1978 George Romero's Dawn of the Dead.
Now we come to the third film in Romero's Dead series, Day of the Dead, and I sometimes go back and forth between which one I like better, this or Dawn. There are times I do say this is my favorite, but then there are times I say Dawn is my favorite. I think Dawn might technically be the best film in this series, but Day might be my personal favorite, if that makes any sense at all.
Oh yeah, definitely. I think that Dawn of the Dead has a more epic feel to it. You see much more of what's going on outside of the mall. Even the mall itself is a big structure, whereas Day of the Dead seems like a more intimate film to me, a more up close and personal film, because you have such a sort of an enclosed setting. You have this bunker that is just concrete walls, and it's just so monotonous and bland and so claustrophobic. Where at least in Dawn of the Dead, you had the mall, but at least you had like color and you had products and you had an ice skating ring and you had music going on and everything. Just Day of the Dead just has this monotony that is just claustrophobic and it's just like suffocating in the film. So for me, it's a much more intimate film. One of the few flaws is it's just the performances. I think some of the performances in the film are a little bit over the top, a little bit like a caricature, especially the soldiers. Where in like Dawn of the Dead, I thought that the performances amongst the ensemble in that film were very naturalistic, very realistic. Where I think that some of the performances in Day of the Dead sort of start to move into sort of parody. Especially the military. I don't know if that was a choice. Was Romero trying to satirize the military and the military mindset? That sort of that masculine, almost like being a parody of the masculine, testosterone-driven need to assert themselves and be the dominant sort of force in the bunker.
I don't mind how over the top the soldiers are, because the way I've always read these characters is these men are pushed to their limits. They've been down there, because it never really says how long they've been down there. I've always interpreted it as because they've been down there for so long, they're at their breaking point. I feel like that's the point of the movie, is these men are collapsing under all this stress, and this is them at their breaking point. And you gotta think about it. Some of these men probably had families who are most likely dead at this point, and it is the end of the world. Like, technically these soldiers are not obligated to be there anymore because there is no government anymore. And I think some of them know that, but for some reason they can't leave. or they think they can't leave, and that's what's really breaking these men down.
Right. Well, I mean, the tensions within and without. I mean, that's one of the things that Romero does so brilliantly in all of the Dead films, is to have tensions within the group of survivors or people trying to survive, and then there's tensions without in terms of the zombie apocalypse that's going on around them. And, so you have characters that are under such immense strain and anxiety and tension because of the inability of the inner and the outer to sort of to counteract each other.
Yeah.
So you have the relationship between Sarah and Miguel. I mean, wow, that is just it's so powerful and it's so sad, and you could see the breakdown in the relationship. And
what I love about that also is I love how Sarah really is the strong one in that relationship. She's arguably the strongest character in the entire film. And I freaking love Sarah. She's arguably my favorite protagonist of the whole series. As much as, in general, I like the characters in Dawn better, Sarah is, I think, probably my favorite protagonist of this series.
And you see her, do you want to talk about a character that's driven to the extremes and to the edge? I mean, she breaks down, but she's still, and I think and that's why I think one of the reasons why there's such a difference for me between the performance of, let's say, Sarah and then the performance of some of the soldiers. Because Sarah's is so real and so down to earth and so, so distraught, and I just believe her so much. And then you have some of the kind of the caricatures and some of the stereotypes that I think kind of come out with the military, with the army guys.
All right.
So to me, I think that even makes it even more striking to me, the difference in the level of the performances.
I think one of the reasons why this for a while was almost considered the black sheep of the series is, like, while the first two movies are dark, there is still, at least with Dawn of the Dead, there's still a sense of fun to it, and there is sort of a warmth to Dawn of the Dead, even though it's technically dealing with really dark subject matter. This movie is, compared to the first two, is so cold and so nihilistic and depressing, but honestly, I love it. I love it because of how depressing it is, and I kind of feel like it needs to be this dark and this nihilistic.
Right. Well, again, and that's one, and I love that too about the film, very much so. But then you have these moments of like comedy, or like where the military is acting, the soldiers are acting a certain way, and even with Bub, and even with Frankenstein, the doctor. Like,
you mean Logan?
Logan, yeah.
They call him Frankenstein in the movie, which
right.
I thought was funny though.
Yeah. So some of those performances I think are a little sort of over the top, or a little bit like cliched. So you have this tone that's really dark, really, depressing. Like you said, very cold. I think that's a good word for it. Very cold. They're underground, literally. So they're away from the sun. So they're underground. And then you have the tone of sort of comedy and satire. So to me, they sit uneasily in the film.
All right. And I never really read it that way. Like, I never really found the soldiers to be comedic, really, except for that one scene where because the soldiers have to gather up the zombies for the scientists to study them, and those two soldiers lock those zombies up in that room, and one of them just goes, "Fuck you!" Yeah. That always cracks me up every time I see the movie, but that's really the only thing I found comedic about these characters. Maybe because of how I read them, how these are men at their breaking point. That's why I kind of don't really see it as over the top or comedic like you might.
Right.
Yeah.
But again, I think it's very interesting that this film is so nihilistic and so dark and so cold, yet it has the happiest ending out of any of the Dead films, And I think one of the reasons that is because finally, I mean, one of the key themes in Day of the Dead is this idea of when to let go. When to finally say, it's over, it's done, the old world is gone, it's not coming back, we're not going to be able to salvage anything, we have to move on. And that's one of the key points of the film is, when do you let go? When do you finally say, enough is enough, there's nothing else that we can do about this, we have to move on. And Sarah's just not ready for that until the end of the movie, and then when she does give up on that, or lets it go and sort of and moves to the future, that's when you have this happy ending. That's when you have the sunlight. Mm-hmm. Right? Because again, it's a dark, cold film because they're always underground, that she's actually able to leave the underground and to go out into the sun at the end.
Yeah. And then one of my favorite scenes in the movie, and this is actually one of my favorite speeches in any horror film, is when John, the helicopter pilot, is talking to Sarah about, like, why don't we just leave here and start over, start fresh, and there's a real philosophy to what he's saying, and then he even says, there's that one moment where he says, you're looking for some kind of explanation for all this? Well, here's one as good as any I've ever found. We've been punished by the Creator. And it's such a chilling scene, but it's also, what he's saying kind of makes sense. In this situation, the whole idea that maybe it's God punishing mankind technically makes the most sense out of all of it, or makes as much sense as all of it.
Well, I agree with it, but I think one of the points is that it doesn't matter why it happened. Doesn't matter. They have to deal with what is right in front of them. They have to deal with the now, not why it happened, not the past. They have to deal with the now. And so many people in this film do not want to deal with the now. You know, they still want to bring back the past, or they want to sort of right the wrongs of the past, or solve the mistakes. And it's like, that's done. It's gone. You're not going to be able to do that. You have to move forward. You have to leave all that behind and move forward. Maybe by moving forward, you will regain the Creator's good graces or whatever. Who knows why? But you can't. You're not going to be. You can't go backwards.
Yeah.
And you certainly staying still here in this basically a tomb, right? And that's the irony of the whole thing, right? The dead are walking around on the surface, and living people are in a tomb, or basically in a concrete coffin.
That's actually, John even says that at one point, like, this is all one great big 14-mile tombstone, and when he says it, it echoes because they're in a cave, basically.
Right, absolutely. But again, think about it. The dead are walking free, roaming free on top, and here are these living people that have pretty much buried themselves under the ground.
And then Rhodes is a great villain. He's even one where, this is where you could really compare this to the first one, Night of the Living Dead. When you think about it, Rhodes is not entirely wrong.
Right.
Like, yeah, Logan's using the remains of his friends for the food for his zombies. You can kind of understand why Rhodes is so pissed off.
I mean, you can even make the case that Logan is the real villain in this film.
Maybe.
You know what I mean? I mean, he's the reason why. Exactly. I mean, Rhodes has a good point. I mean, you know, Rhodes wanted to be in charge, and his obsession with, being the authority figure and being the leader, and for them to respect his authority and have control, that's not a good thing either. But Logan is someone who's, what's the point of these experiments? Like, it's just science for science sake, with nothing really helping them. It didn't really help them at all. If anything, it made things worse.
Yeah. Well, I think his justification was domesticating them was the only way we could coexist with them.
But how could you just domesticate them when you have millions, if not billions, of dead, reanimated corpses running around? It's just it was on a scale that just was could not happen. It was not a pragmatic way of doing things, and he just seemed to be doing science for science sake. It really wasn't helping anything in the community there. It wasn't helping. If anything, it was diminishing the community there. It wasn't adding to. It wasn't contributing to the community. I really like the score in the film too. I believe John Harrison is the one who did the score for Day of the Dead. And he, in addition to Day of the Dead, he also did Creepshow.
Oh yeah, I love the score for this movie. This is actually, as much as I love Goblin's score for Dawn of the Dead, I actually like this better. They're two different movies. Even though, this is a sequel to Dawn of the Dead, it's still a different film, and the music for this movie wouldn't have worked for Dawn of the Dead, just like the music for Dawn of the Dead wouldn't have worked for this movie.
Absolutely, yeah. I think
but this is a great score, though. It really is.
Yes, excellent.
And then to go back to John, when he says that to Sarah about how, the explanation that it's God causing this is better than any other, is as good as any other explanation. I love some of the dialogue he says there, where it's like, maybe he didn't want to see us blow ourselves up and put a big hole in his sky. Maybe he was just trying to show us that he was still the boss. Maybe he figured we was getting too big for our britches, trying to figure his shit out. I just love that dialogue.
Right. And again, think about as a criticism of science, of what what Logan is still doing. You know what I mean? I think it's very clear that's one of the things that Romero was getting at here, is this idea that, okay, science is great and everything, but when it's not contributing to the community, when it's just existing for its own sake, that's not good either.
To go to Logan and Bub, first of all, I actually think Bub is pretty awesome, but I think it's interesting how they call him Dr. Frankenstein in the movie. And I always thought Bub looked a little bit like the Frankenstein monster. I have a feeling that was definitely done on purpose.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And the guy, I don't know the actor's name who plays Bub, but he's great. He's really good in the film. He brings like a pathos to a zombie, which you normally wouldn't feel any emotions for a zombie in the film.
And also, me being a Stephen King fan, I love the scene where Logan's trying to get Bub to read Stephen King's Salem's Lot, or has the book on the table and stuff.
That's cool.
Yeah.
Now, I heard a rumor that supposedly Bub shows up in one of the Walking Dead.
He does, I think, but
right.
Obviously Walking Dead's not in the same continuity, but I guess they did it as a little in-joke, because this is actually the first movie that Greg Nicotero worked on. Greg Nicotero was pretty much a protege of Tom Savini, and of course Greg Nicotero went on to be a major part of The Walking Dead. And The Walking Dead obviously would not exist had it not been for Romero's Dead films.
And out of all of Romero's Dead films, I think the film that most resembles Walking Dead is Day of the Dead. Speaking of Tom Savini, his effects in this movie are unbelievable.
Actually, I would argue this is probably his best effects out of any movie.
Absolutely. Yeah. That one scene where the zombie gets up and the guts just fall out of his stomach. I always remember that scene. I always. But yeah, the effects in this movie are unbelievable.
And this is so gory, too. Especially Rhodes's death at the end of the film. Actually, Rhodes's death is one of the best villain comeuppances in any movie.
And I love that even when he's getting killed, he's got to he has to get the last word in. Yeah. He's got to exert his control. He's got to exert his power.
God!
Yeah, it's great, Even while he's being consumed, he's got to, still got to be the alpha male,
Yeah.
But yeah, Day of the Dead is amazing. It's an amazing film. And I think it's a film that really has, over time, there's been a real critical reevaluation of this film. And I think it actually has, people's opinions about the film and the critical value of the film actually have heightened since its release. Because when it released, it really got very mediocre, if not bad reviews. It didn't do well in the box office either. I think it was the same year. It was a great year for zombie flicks because I think Return of the Living Dead, Day of the Dead, and Reanimator all came out in the same year. So you had three of the best,
And even if you want to count it as a zombie film, Demons came out this year.
Absolutely, yeah. So that was a really good year for horror. Well, I think it was very brave of Romero to make Sarah the main protagonist, to make a woman a protagonist in this film, because even though women did figure into the other two Dead films, those films were more ensembles, where you had sort of, where it was kind of shared. The lead acting kind of was shared, especially in Dawn of the Dead. Dawn of the Dead has a really great ensemble sort of cast. Whereas in this film, really Sarah is the main character. She is the protagonist, And I think it was very brave of him to make make a woman the protagonist, and she does an amazing job of it. And then, just the fact that when she has to sever her own boyfriend's arm. Right, that's with the machete. That's just what a shocking scene. It's just the things that this woman has to go through in this movie are horrible, Mm-hmm. But she survives it, and she gets to live, and she gets to sort of move on. So that's a positive, a positive sort of a thing in the film as well. That's just the opening sequence when she's having the dream, when she looks on the calendar, and I think it's October, right? And then all the hands come through the wall. That's an amazing scene. Mm-hmm. I remember watching it with other people and people just jumping at that scene. I knew what was going to happen because I'd seen it before, but I watched it with 2 or 3 other people and they all jumped in that scene when all the hands came through the wall.
Remember when I said Dawn of the Dead does touch on gender issues a little bit? I would say this one even more so because you could tell that a lot of the soldiers especially very much look down on Sarah because she's a woman.
There's that vague sexual threat, doesn't it, at one point
where Rhodes says, maybe I should lock Miguel up in a cage and give the rest of us a shot at some lovin'.
It's funny because I always compare the way that the military is portrayed in this film with 28 Days Later.
Okay.
Remember in the second half of 28 Days Later when they meet the military that are up there. I always draw a lot of comparisons between sort of the way Romero portrays the military in Day of the Dead with how Danny Boyle does in 28 Days Later.
I think it's a great film. It's, in my opinion, a masterpiece. I think it's just as much of a masterpiece as Night and Dawn, and I'm so glad the film has developed a fan base over the years, but to me, it is a great movie that, unfortunately, even today, still people kind of slag. There's still people consider this the worst film of Romero's original Dead trilogy. And
well, I think also Romero didn't do himself any favors because I remember in interviews, I think he even said this even afterwards, I guess he had said that he had I guess the third film he had imagined as this much bigger, sprawling, epic zombie film, and then when the financing dropped out, he had to do it on a much smaller scale. So I think right off the bat, when Romero's saying that about the film, people already were like, oh, well, it could have been this much better. By him having to cut it down, it must be a lesser film.
But I actually think that kind of worked in the film's favor. I like how it is sort of, I'll agree with you there, it is kind of a more intimate film because it feels more apocalyptic. This is where you really get a sense of the end of the world. You don't know if there's anybody else outside of this bunker. I still like to think that it's in the same universe as Night and Dawn, so I would like to think maybe somewhere, Fran and Peter are still alive in this timeline, but you don't know that, You don't know if anybody's still alive outside this bunker, really.
And I love the opening sequence is great.
Yeah.
When the newspaper blows and it says "The Dead Walk," that's such brilliant.
That was actually ripped off in Resident Evil.
Yeah, that's cool. I thought that was such a great opening sequence.
And then you had the alligator zombie, and then the one zombie with his tongue hanging out from his jaw and stuff.
Right, and then that's when the title sequence starts. Right, that's great. Yeah, it's just such it's a great film.
I like how before the events of the film, there was a character named Major Cooper who died right before the events of the film, and the one scientist who says, I thought Cooper was an asshole, but he was a sweetheart next to Rose. And I was wondering if that was a little meta joke, because Cooper was the main human antagonist, or Harry Cooper was the main human antagonist of the first one. Maybe that was sort of Romero saying, oh, you thought Harry Cooper was an asshole, wait till you meet Rose.
But, that's great. Yeah, no, I never put that together. That's very interesting.
And also, I've always had a fan theory that maybe the character of Major Cooper was a relative of Harry Cooper from the first film. Just like my little headcanon.
That's cool, yeah. No, I can see that. That would be awesome.
There was a direct-to-DVD movie in 2004 or 2005 called Day of the Dead 2 Contagium. The movie claiming to be the sequel to Day of the Dead, even though, in my opinion, Land of the Dead is the sequel to Day of the Dead. But I got it on DVD for Christmas back in around 2005 or 2006, and I started watching it, fell asleep through it, never watched it again. And it's sitting in a drawer in my room, and it's one of those DVDs I'm probably never going to watch again, even though I have it. And then there was the 2008, I think it was 2008 remake of Day of the Dead. Have you seen that?
Yeah, it was terrible.
Was it? Yeah,
I did. It was terrible.
When the movie was coming out, I was excited because, I liked the Night of the Living Dead remake, and I liked the Dawn of the Dead remake. But then when I saw that trailer, I thought it was absolutely hilarious, but I don't think it was meant to be.
No, it was terrible. Horrible.
Yeah. There's also another remake of Day of the Dead, which actually came out this year, called Day of the Dead Bloodline.
I don't know why we need to remake a movie twice, but whatever.
Yeah. Here's Chris's review on Day of the Dead.
So Day of the Dead is where things start getting interesting, because we get Bubba, who is a zombie that is starting to articulate and is starting to figure out how things can be utilized. He's building an intellect. I will say that this one is cool because it's as intimate as Dawn was. It's not like a bigger group of people. It's sort of these very isolated people who are in a bunker underground, and there's very little chance that the zombies are going to break in. But here's the thing, they do anyway. Spoiler alert. I like that idea. Is you really are not safe from these things at all. You're very much fucked no matter what fortress you manage to build up. And a big part of what makes this one work so well is that fucking Colonel. The dude is such a great villain. He's such an asshole, but the thing that works about him is that he's an asshole who gets shit done. He's a blunt object. But Bubba is, I love, there's almost like this cool sort of protagonist-antagonist dynamic that starts to build between Bubba and the Colonel, or at least I think is maybe like an unsaid thing between Bubba and the Colonel. This Colonel who's all about all right, we're building it up, we're starting to figure things out, we can fuck all the zombies up, and then you get this one zombie who's starting to become a little bit more, I guess for lack of a better word, sentient would be a better way to look at it. And then again, that heightens that whole theme that these things are us, and we're them, and as much as they've been afflicted with this condition, they are still human. You know, they are still, they're us. You know, and it's well, at the end of the day, the villain is people. So obviously, yeah, this one isn't at the same level of like iconic as the first two, but it is good and it is great to watch, and you know the same great themes are going, and it's definitely it's where things start to take a turn with Bubba becoming like intelligent, especially as you get into Land, which we'll go into next. So as much as it's not necessarily the best of them, it is definitely an interesting one, and you can't deny that it's not a cool movie. It's just, I think it wasn't as direct in themes as the other ones were. I think that's what kind of makes it, for some people, probably feel like a lesser one. I still like it a lot, but yeah, obviously not as amazing as the first two. But for real, check it out if you haven't seen it, and I hope you enjoy it if you do check it out.
Here's John's review of Day of the Dead.
They say this is a film you like watch like a few more times to like it. Actually, when I first saw it, I actually like really liked it like right away. I think it was like it kind of like blew my mind like how like it just shows that a third film can be good in a series. The first one took place at a house. The second one was at a mall. This was like underground, where you like see like this military that are like to see like who was like the last survivors, and the character Sarah. She was probably like my favorite like character of the series, because she was, unlike the first two women who were just like damsel in distresses, she was a badass. Like seriously, she did not, for once, she did not need like she was like kind of like in a way like what like Ripley or Sarah Connor were. People should put Sarah on the list of best like female heroics for that time period. Rose, oh my god, biggest jerk of the series, and I mean biggest jerk of the movie, I should say. He, in the end, he gets what he deserved, because when he dies, it wasn't that big of a loss. I feel like out of the first two, this is probably the most gore I saw of the series. Wouldn't you agree with that?
Yeah.
In a way, when you watch Day of the Dead, it has a little bit like of a Son of Frankenstein references, and because George Romero is a huge fan of the Universal monsters, Day of the Dead is like the zombie version of Son of Frankenstein, but just done with zombies instead. What I mean by that is that when you see the doctor have a zombie as an experiment, he's trying to teach him to be a human being, kind of similar to what Dr. Frankenstein was trying to do with the monster, like makes him a monster and trying to make him be more human-like.
Here's Nick's review on Day of the Dead.
Alright, so George Romero's Day of the Dead. So my buddy Christian, who's making this video, I believe this is his favorite film in the trilogy. It is the darkest film in the trilogy. It is definitely the antithesis of Dawn of the Dead. Where Dawn of the Dead, we have this, cowboys running through the mall, having a good time, with this warm kind of color palette and stuff like that. We moved from that to Day of the Dead, which is very dark. We're headed underground now. We're not having fun with these characters, so to say. I mean, these characters are really starting to break down now. And we're starting to see the breakdown of humanity and everything that goes along with that. I think out of the original trilogy, I think this is my least favorite. But that's not saying a lot, because it's like my least favorite of my favorite movies of all time. And I still, rewatch Day of the Dead all the time. I just don't think it's as rewatchable as Dawn of the Dead. I think if I need to pick one to watch, I'm probably going to pick Dawn. One thing I loved about Day of the Dead, though, was the complexity of the characters. So I really liked Captain Rhodes, and I really liked Frankenstein. As a scientist myself, during the zombie apocalypse, I probably would also be doing some sort of experiments and trying to, that would be kind of probably my role on the team. And I love the character of Bub. I love the idea that the zombies are, in a way, adapting and becoming a little bit more sophisticated. I think that was really amazing, and those scenes with Bub at the end were just so entertaining and awesome. So my first time watching this, unlike Night of the Dead and Dawn of the Dead, I don't really have like a moment where I remember watching it. I remember how it being influential on me. I think I saw Day of the Dead on, 30 Days of Fear, like one of those TV channels where they have 30 horror movies before Halloween. I think I caught it like 2 o'clock in the morning or something like that before I couldn't go to sleep. And I remember really liking it, but definitely was not my favorite. I will say that I think the special effects in this film are probably the best of the trilogy, and that I think we have Gregory Nicotero working with George for the first time, and so that was really amazing. Those end scenes where the guys are being ripped apart, and Rhodes scream and choke on them, and you see the whole torso being removed, and I think that those are really, really awesome additions. And I love the zombies in this one. I love the kind of realistic kind of approach they took. Unlike Dawn, which was very, this blue kind of palette, in which, photographed as blue. In Day of the Dead, there's this very kind of grittiness to the zombies. I really kind of feel that they were previously people, and I didn't really get that quite as much in Dawn. So, overall, Day of the Dead is definitely not my favorite, but I definitely love it and I appreciate it, and I definitely can connect with it in many ways. So, that is my commentary on George Romero's Day of the Dead.
Now we come to the fourth film in Romero's Dead series, Land of the Dead, which came out in 2005, so this was 20 years after Day of the Dead, and Land of the Dead, this is another one that, like Day of the Dead, was really kind of hated when it came out, but it has, in recent years, it seemed to develop a bit of a cult following. And personally, I like Land of the Dead a lot. I think this is a really good movie. But in my opinion, this is the final film of Romero's Dead series. Even though we're going to talk about Diary of the Dead and Survival, I really don't count those. For me, this is where the series ends. For me personally, but that's my opinion.
Yeah, I thought Land of the Dead was really good. I remember seeing it in 2005 when it came out. I was so excited. A new Romero Dead film, And I remember seeing it. I guess I had outsized expectations for it when I went to go see it. And going to see it and liking it, but just feeling like it just did not meet the standards of the other three. But subsequently, on rewatching it, it is an amazing movie. It is really, really good. And I think it does belong in the upper echelon of zombie films.
I hold it on par with the original trilogy, or the original Dead trilogy. I think it's the logical conclusion to that, and logical continuation, because it is kind of a continuation of Day of the Dead when you think about it, because in the movie you see zombies start to develop human intelligence, kind of like Bub did. I used to try to connect that in my head, that maybe Bub somehow ran across the black zombie that you see in the film and taught him, but that's a little ridiculous because those are miles apart. I don't think Bub would have really gotten, but I come up with weird headcanons sometimes to connect films, but cool. It's still sort of a extension of what you saw in Day of the Dead.
Right. And you can see how prophetic Romero was making that film. So many of those class issues are still with us, if not have gotten even worse. The divide between working class and elite class, has really sort of widened over this time with the loss of the middle class, of the increase in protected communities where trying to sort of keep themselves away from the masses of humanity. So again, I think it was a really prophetic film that Romero was able to see these things happening and what the logical conclusion of this kind of thinking and these kind of actions would be.
The first three films are making commentaries on race and gender and even religion to a certain extent, whereas this film, the main thing it's talking about is class, but I also think class is honestly the biggest issue in our society.
Absolutely, very true.
Yeah.
It's the thing that everything else kind of sort of revolves around. So Romero did an amazing job with the film, and he really does, and it doesn't ever fall into sort of parody or caricature. And the performances are great. Dennis Hopper is amazing in the film. Asia Argento is awesome. But then again, I love her and everything. But it's really even John Leguizamo, who I did not expect to be so good in his role, is very good in the film. They're very believable characters.
Yeah, to go back to some of the political and social commentary of the film, you could tell that Romero's definitely sort of making a statement on the the Bush administration, because that was the current administration at the time this came out.
Yeah.
Like, you could definitely see this. There's a lot of, like, post-9/11 parallels you could see with this
absolutely.
film.
Very much so. Very much so. How people used a catastrophe, how people used a tragedy to better themselves, or to sort of profit off of those things, or to gain more control and more power after that. And you see that very much in Dennis Hopper's character.
When I saw this with my aunt back in 2005, my aunt was like, the one thing I don't understand is what good is money anymore? But I think that's kind of the point of the movie, is money really isn't good anymore, but these people think it is.
Right. It's about status and privilege. That's what it's about, not about the material, what money, about the value, it's more of this idea of, what it represents rather than what it actually is anymore. How did you feel about the main character? I thought he was kind of, I liked him, don't get me wrong, but I just, in comparison to some of the other characters in the film, I thought he came off as kind of bland.
It never really bothered me, really. Yeah. I think all the performances in the film are pretty much good across the board.
I really like his partner with the burnt, scarred face. I thought he did a really good job.
I liked him a lot.
Yeah, he was really good. But yeah, I mean, like I said, I just thought it was really well acted, and the script is really is really well constructed as well. There's movement in the script, but you never get a loss of the sense of what's important and where the script's going. Where the story's going overall.
I want to point out that. Now, I'm actually a little behind, because I read the Walking Dead comics, but I'm a little behind right now. Apparently, the current story arc in the Walking Dead comics, from what my friend told me about them, seems like they're taking a lot from this movie, because apparently the current Walking Dead story arc is dealing a lot with class, because apparently there's like a fenced-off community of survivors who are now going back to the old ways of society and stuff, and it seems like that might have been taken off from this, which wouldn't surprise me, because Robert Kirkman, who wrote the Walking Dead comics, outright admits that, those wouldn't exist if it wasn't for Romero's Dead series.
I also think it's interesting in the film, especially in Land of the Dead, even in the face of being able to rewrite society, to rebuild society, to go in new directions, people will still fall back on the old systems and the old structures. Yeah. Even in the face of being able to say, we can restart again. We can get rid of things like class. We can get rid of these things, that are sort of oppressive, and try to make a more equitable society. People will still fall back on the repressive aspects of the former society.
Any closing thoughts on Land of the Dead?
I think it's a very underrated film. I think it's a great sort of end to the original Romero sort of Dead films. And I think that it's probably going to have much more critical reevaluation as time goes on.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's an underrated film, personally. I don't like it as much as the first three, but it's still good. It still deserves its place among those first three films.
Absolutely. Quality film.
Here's Chris's review of Land of the Dead.
So here we are at Land of the Dead. So right out of the gate, I'm going to say, outside the classics, the obvious classics of the zombie genre, Night, Dawn, whatever, honestly, this is my all-time favorite zombie movie. I can't properly say why. What I can say is that I think it's the fact that I saw it at a young age, and I think this may have been the first zombie movie I saw in a big theater, properly. That probably has a big part to do with it. But the thing that I love about this one is that the themes start talking about the gap between rich and poor, which, at that point in time was something that people were really starting to become wary of, and, was an important thing to talk about. The idea of, this safe haven for rich people, that was, on the, and it was, the middle class was on the outskirts of it, but still protected. And in some degree, they were kind of protecting it for the rich people. There's some obvious, an analogy going there. And then Big Daddy, who is kind of an evolution of Bubba from the first one. The zombie who's starting to get intelligent, and then you see them starting to use guns, and you see them in a phone booth. the zombies are starting to become their own thing, and it's kind of implied by the end that they may just, end up being half of what's on Earth. Yeah, that really great, strangely beautiful ending where they're about to take out a horde of them that's being led by Big Daddy. And Simon's character, he just sees him and he goes, "No, don't shoot at them. They're just looking for a place to go." And there's almost Big Daddy kind of looks at the van and he's just like, "Yeah, okay." He's just like, "Oh, yeah, thanks for not shooting us," and he walks off. Very, very cool and unexpected, especially after at this point 4 movies of zombie mayhem. There to just almost sort of be a last minute truce, where they're like, fuck it, man. They're just they're people like us as much as they're rabid. They're starting to come back to our level to some degree. And that whole thing where the fireworks are starting to not really take effect anymore. It's easier for them to try to figure out how to kill people, that kind of thing. So yeah, once again, they're us and we're them. Again, this one, another great extension from Day of the Dead. Awesome fucking villain played by Dennis Hopper. One of my favorites ever. He's such an asshole. He's a racist dick, A lot of people, I wonder if you guys realize Romero is Cuban, right? Just want you guys to know that, because in a bunch of these movies, people say fucked up shit to Latino people. There's one point where Leguizamo comes back as a zombie, and Dennis sees him, grabs a gun, and he goes, "Fucking spick bastard," and he starts shooting at him. And that's really resonant for me because I'm a Latino, and this is obvious. You could say like it's an offshoot of like the immigration debate or whatever, but it is. You could tell that George is kind of using these movies to assuage some kind of gripes that he has, with racism and stuff like that, because he is a white Latino. He's probably a dude that a lot of people would say fucked up shit about Hispanic people too, not realizing that George was Hispanic. So that's an interesting little kind of subplot to these themes. The idea of racism in general. Obviously, with the original, Ben was a black dude, and in the morning he's just like killed willy nilly. But as time goes on, the Latino characters that are kind of on the sidelines, they get like people talk shit about them, and I'm sure that had like a personal significance for George. But moving on from that, I really love the characters in this one. Argento's daughter, she plays an awesome character. Simon Baker, it was very cool to see him in this. Dennis Hopper's character, again, awesome villain. Love Leguizamo. I'm not like a diehard fan of the guy, but it really, if you give him the right role, he will knock it out of the park. I love Cholo. He's so funny and so cool and so likable. And I love him coming back as a zombie at the end. It's almost empowering to him because now he has the means to take down Dennis. He can fuck him over as a dead person, and that's, again, continuing that theme, it's us and we're them. And the idea that somebody would turn into a zombie and think of it as almost like something, take it on almost as though it's something that's productive and something that will get something done. That's very interesting, especially since we're 4 movies in now, and nobody has wanted to turn into a zombie at this point. So yeah, this really is like my personal favorite zombie movie. There's just so much that I love about it. I love the idea of the van. That's just like in the concept of zombie movies. That's so cool. This like armored up fucking surveillance van that can just fuck up zombies. It's like the exact kind of thing you would want in a zombie apocalypse, obviously with Fiddler's Green, that's a great, sort of physical representation, physical architectural representation of the gap between rich and poor and the weird symbiosis that goes between the two. One kind of talks shit about the other, despite the fact that the other is what's kind of building the foundation for the one that's that is talking shit about the other one. Very, very interesting and very cool. And beyond that, yeah, really, if this is one that you write off, I really invite you to come back to it and try to reanalyze it and try to see it for what it is, because I really feel like it didn't get the recognition it deserved. And not to be a downer, but going into Diary, I mean, Romero is sadly dead now, and honestly, this was the last good one. After this, it was kind of just like, meh, this is kind of him in top form for the last time. And I'm sorry to be kind of pessimistic about it, but that's just how I look at it. This kind of like, this was his last hurrah, is basically how I look at it. Not that I don't see anything in Diary, but this is just a great, well-made, very cool, very enjoyable, and very thought-provoking zombie movie. And I personally consider it almost like kind of like the series finale, because it ends in this place where we're not really sure what the relationship is going to be between humans and zombies anymore. It's going to change. It's going to evolve and be very different. And it's cool that we never quite got a resolution to that, because Diary sort of goes back in time to some degree. It's up in the air what comes next at the end of this, and I kind of like that we never quite get an answer. It's totally ambiguous. It's something that we can discuss and debate about and figure out for ourselves. And that's honestly what any good story wants you to do. It wants you to ask questions. It wants to ask you questions, and it wants you to figure out how you feel about it. So I absolutely love Land of the Dead for that. All-time favorite zombie movie, and I don't regret it at all.
Here's John's review of Land of the Dead.
I don't know, Day of the Dead was more, like, exciting for me than this one was. I mean, some parts I did. Also, one thing I can point out, I didn't like how, like, the blood effects were all CGI, which kind of, like... I mean, yeah, I get it. That's what this modern day of film is all about. But I don't know. I prefer like to see the effect and also see the real like fake blood rather than a CGI effect. This was probably the second time I ever watched an Asia Argento film, believe it or not, because the first one I saw was Vin Diesel's Triple X, which not a bad film. That's just average summer blockbuster popcorn flick. Whereas in this film, she's pretty awesome in this movie.
Now we come to what is technically the fifth film in Romero's Dead series, Diary of the Dead, but I personally don't really count this film. Not that it's a bad film by any means, but the reason I don't count it is, despite the fact that there is a timeline discrepancy with the first four films, I could still buy that Night, Dawn, Day, and Land are in the same universe, even though there is a bit of a timeline issue. It's a huge, huge suspension of disbelief for me to buy that this movie is happening, like, because this is the beginning of the zombie apocalypse in this film. It's a huge suspension of disbelief for me to buy that, okay, the events of Night of the Living Dead are happening during the events of this movie, considering, okay, you have the internet now, and, like, this is clearly set in modern day, so I really don't count this at all. If anything, I would say, okay, maybe you could say this is a reboot of the series, but for me personally, this is just another zombie film that happened to be directed by George Romero. It does have some of the same social commentary, like there's obviously a lot of commentary on the internet. It's not a bad film, but I'll admit, like, I haven't seen this film in close to 10 years, so I'm going to have to defer to Bill here, but that's my thoughts on Diary of the Dead. It's not a bad film, but I really don't count it as part of the series. But what do you think of Diary?
Yeah, I agree with you. I agree with a lot of the things you said. I find it hard to believe that there's any kind of, concurrent continuity with the film. I also feel like this film and the Survival of the Dead films, I just feel so bad for George Romero, because you get the sense that, the very thing he worried about was being sort of just branded as a zombie director, because clearly he was an intellectual, clearly he was an artist. He can make films about any number of subjects. The Creepshow is amazing. Martin's amazing. He's made other films that were just amazing films.
I actually really like his adaptation of Stephen King's The Dark Half.
Right, Monkey Shines. was a brilliant man, and to see that probably the only way anybody was going to give him any money to make movies was if he made another zombie movie. It's just sad. It's sad to see him, because I think that was one of the things he was most concerned about, was being sort of pigeonholed as a zombie film director, and that's exactly what happened to him.
Yeah. Here's Chris's review of Diary of the Dead.
So now we're on to the last one that I'm going to review. I still haven't seen Survival, unfortunately. From what I've heard, that doesn't really mean shit, so I guess we'll just leave that as it is. What I will say about Diary is it's Romero trying to do something different. And he's trying to do something different in a way that was very prominent at the time. Footage movies were kind of the thing when this had come out. You know, it was really like, I think it was not too long either like before or after Cloverfield, and yeah, they were about to go into this big resurgence. You know, I think Paranormal Activity too was around the same time. So it's him kind of dipping his toes into different waters and seeing what comes of it. I can appreciate that. I like it when, you know, I think I've said this on Christian's reviews before. I do like it when you see people try to step outside their comfort zone and try to do something different and something unique from what they've done before. The footage format does work well. I will say that. I like it a lot in this movie. But honestly, story-wise, it's just not that great. I like the idea of like dialing it back and showing like the initial attack and all that, like the implication that, okay, maybe this took place on the same night as Night. Yeah, this is like another perspective of how everything started, but it's just not that great, and I do wish it was better. Some of it, I guess, maybe the acting, although it's not terrible. But I think just on a whole, like it's strangely straightforward. You know what I mean? There's nothing really interesting going on here, as much as, you know, it is, I guess, kind of engaging. You know, themes are the same as before. There are some of them. That's been my motto for these reviews. Obviously, they're keeping the military thing going with the whole, I think halfway through, like, the military dudes, like, rob them of all their shit. You know, like, that's interesting, for sure. The idea that they would be the villains in this situation. But, yeah, beyond that, you know, I don't care too much for it. It's kind of a cool thing to see, like, George try to do something a little different. But, yeah, beyond that, I don't really see that much in it.
Then I guess we should move on to Survival. I've never seen Survival. If you want to count both Diary and Survival as part of the series, this is the only one in the series I haven't seen, so I defer to you.
Again, it's a sad movie. It's not a horrible movie.
Not sad in a good
way.
way.
Right, not sad in exactly.
Not sad like Day of the Dead was sad.
Exactly. So it's not a horrible movie. It's a well-made movie. You get the feeling from seeing it. Maybe I'm reading a lot into it. Is that Romero's heart just wasn't into these films, especially the Survival. It just wasn't in his heart. Wasn't into it. I think he was the good trooper. He was the good soldier. He did do promotion for it. He did say, oh, you know, they're just as good as, or, you know, they're you know, vital contributions to his other films. But you could just tell they weren't. And like I said, it's just sad that he was unable to make the films that he really wanted to make. Or to go into other genres, you know. Because again, I think there's a lot of films that he did want to make, but for whatever reason, you know, there was, for a long time, he was rumored to be directing The Stand. There was a lot of projects that he was sort of linked to, and I just sort of never came together, you know. Yeah. The only other film I could think of that sort of, you know, was the Two Evil Eyes, that one that he did with Dario Argento that he collaborated on, you know, that he was actually able to sort of make the film he wanted to make. But it's just sad that outside of zombie movies, you know, he was not given the independence and the trust to make, you know, really great films, which clearly he could have.
Yeah, no, I agree. So, any closing thoughts on Romero's Dead series?
Probably, if not probably the most important series of films in horror cinema.
Yeah, no, I agree. And, like, once again, like, if it wasn't for these films, stuff like Resident Evil, The Walking Dead, even though I don't count 28 Days Later as a zombie film because they're not dead, they're just infected, but 28 Days Later wouldn't exist without these films.
Shaun of the Dead wouldn't exist without this film.
That's something I wanted to talk about when we were talking about Dawn of the Dead. Shaun of the Dead, which is a great film.
Absolutely, it's great. And really, I mean, that film, you want to talk about Edgar Wright and Simon Pegg's love of Romero. I mean,
they use some of the same music from Dawn of the Dead, which is amazing. And then you had stuff like Return of the Living Dead, which is also considered to be sort of an unofficial sequel to Night, because Return of the Living Dead is very loosely based on John Russo's book, Return of the Living Dead, which he wrote as a sequel to Night of the Living Dead, even though, once again, in my opinion, the other Dead films are the sequels to Night of the Living Dead. But you had Return of the Living Dead, which obviously was a spoof on Night of the Living Dead. And
it's such a classic. That's another classic. But you know what's funny is that it really went in a different direction than the Romero films did, but it still was able to make social commentary. It still was able to do a lot of the same things that Romero did, but did it in a totally different way. And I think that, like Dan O'Bannon did an amazing job with that film.
I also think Return of the Living Dead is a great meta film. It really does play around with the conventions and expectations of the zombie genre. When you find out the zombies in that movie don't get killed by destroying the brain, you had the one character who's like, but it worked in the movie.
That's great. And the fact that they run fast, and they're so yeah, I mean, Return of the Living Dead is great. And again, it's such another really important touchstone for a lot of the later zombie films. That's really the 21st century. Has really been the century of the zombie, and and not only was George Romero responsible for that, but you got to give Dan O'Bannon credit for that as well.
Yeah, we already talked about Walking Dead, but both the comics and the TV show The Walking Dead, I would argue, are kind of an extension of Romero's Dead series. Obviously, they're not in the same continuity, but thematically, I feel like they're an extension. They're not so much about social commentary; they're much more about the character drama. But I'm actually I know Romero did not like Walking Dead when it first came out, but I feel like it's actually pretty true to some of the stuff that Romero touched on in his movies. So I don't know why he didn't really like it. Admittedly, the show is not as good as it used to be, but I still have no real problems with Walking Dead.
I wonder if he just was so sick of zombies. He just was so sick of it. He just didn't want to hear about it anymore. He said what he had to say, when I was being forced to say more about a subject that he already said what he had to say about it. So I'm wondering if that's what it is. Because Walking Dead. I mean, again, Walking Dead is about the sort of the inability of human beings to work together a lot of times, right? Yeah. And to impose power on each other and control. And look at the governor. Look at Negan. A lot of those things can be directly connected to a lot of the concerns that Romero had in his Dead films.
Yeah. But that was our retrospective on Romero's Dead series. I hope you enjoyed it, and if there is a heaven and he's up there right now, I hope he listens to this in heaven.
Thank you, George.
Thank you so much.
They're coming to get you, Barbara.